They never wanted you to hear this, and after tonight, you may wish you hadn't. Picture this. The year is 1832, deep in the pine-choked wilderness of Blackmoor Hollow, a place not found on most maps. A towering estate rots behind iron gates and withered ivy. Locals call it cursed ground, the land where sound dies, the land where people vanish. But the house belongs to them, the Blackmoor family. For over 2 centuries, whispers have crawled out of those forests like fog, stories of ritual, bloodlines tainted by something older than sin, and disappearances no one dared investigate. The Blackmoors weren't just aristocrats, they weren't just landowners, they were architects of something darker, a hidden order operating behind closed doors, binding wealth, influence, and ancient rites into a quiet empire. And they were untouchable. The Blackmoor bloodline arrived on American soil during the colonial unrest of the 1700s, presenting themselves as philanthropists from the old world. But behind the elegant facade lay a history that European monarchs themselves buried, links to occult circles, forgotten cults, and experiments in psychological domination masked as enlightenment. For generations, men vanished into their service. Women were reformed behind their gates, returning with eyes hollow as graves. But no one spoke of it. The Blackmoors funded hospitals, schools, even churches. They bought silence with silver and erased doubts with disappearances. Tonight, we're tearing off the velvet mask. What I'm about to tell you has been sealed in archives, locked behind cathedral walls, hidden in family crypts for over 200 years, documents obtained through whispers, testimonies smuggled out by those who escaped, and records so disturbing even federal agents refuse to make them public. This isn't just a tale of a family. It's the anatomy of control, the mechanisms of elite secrecy, the engineering of obedience, and the suppression of inconvenient truth. The question is, do you have the nerve to go further? Because once you hear what I'm about to reveal, you'll never look at history or your own reflection the same way again. Welcome to the true forbidden history of the Blackmoor family. It begins, as most forbidden legacies do, with a death, and a disappearance no one was allowed to explain. In 1787, the ship Mercy's Vale docked under cover of night in Newburyport, Massachusetts. Officially, she was a trade vessel returning from Europe, but the harbour master recorded something odd. Her manifest listed textiles and books, yet the crew, they were missing. Every soul gone. Except for one passenger, the man who signed himself as Alaric Blackmoor. Witnesses described him as tall, impossibly pale, with eyes that seemed almost silver in lamplight. His presence unnerved the toughest sailors. They said he spoke like a scholar but carried himself like someone used to command, someone used to obedience that wasn't earned but expected. And within a week, the ship burned to the waterline. Every document, every trace, consumed. But Alaric, he remained. He wasted no time acquiring land, hundreds of acres along the New England frontier, territory no sane settler wanted, swampland, forests older than memory, and those hollow stretches where birds refused to sing. Locals muttered of strange sightings, black carriages at dusk, chants carried on the fog, animals found mutilated in ritual patterns too complex for superstition. But the Blackmoor fortunes silenced questions. They funded churches, repaired roads, handed out gold like candy, and in return, they built their estate. A fortress of granite and iron in the heart of Blackmoor Hollow. 3 stories high, walls thicker than bank vaults, stained glass so dark no light escaped. And then, the disappearances began. Farmhands, servants, local women drawn to promises of work or charity. They entered the Blackmoor gates and were never seen again. Those who asked questions, accidents, fires, ruined reputations. It was a silent war, one of whispers and shadows, and the Blackmoors always won. But the real horror was beneath the estate. You see, buried under that house, hidden behind labyrinth tunnels and catacomb stone, lay the Blackmoor Sanctum, a subterranean labyrinth designed not for worship, but for manipulation. A place where the boundaries between the mind and obedience were broken, where faith was shattered and rebuilt under the family's control. And Alaric? He wasn't just building wealth, he was building an experiment, one designed to master the human will, to fracture identity, to create not just loyal servants, but programmable, perfect vessels. And this was only the beginning. Imagine this, a place where memory is stripped, identity is rewritten, and obedience isn't demanded. It's engineered. That was the purpose of the Blackmoor sanctum. While polite society believed the Blackmoor estate was nothing more than another Gothic relic of the wealthy elite, beneath those stone floors, far from the gaze of law or conscience, lay chambers meticulously crafted for one reason: psychological transfiguration. The survivors, few as they were, spoke of endless corridors carved with symbols older than Christianity, doorways etched with esoteric diagrams blending alchemy, geometry, and forbidden languages. The deeper you descended, the more reality. Fractured. No clocks, no windows, no sound except for the calculated whispers of those in control. They called it the recalibration. The process was simple, if evil can ever be simple. Subjects, often women considered troublesome, rebellious, or inconvenient by their families, were sent to the estate for correction. What awaited them was systematic mental dismantling, weeks of sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, and ancient rituals borrowed from the darker fringes of European occultism. But the most disturbing part, it worked. Testimonies, sealed away for nearly 200 years, describe women returning to society as blank slates, smiling, compliant, obedient, but hollow. Their eyes, wrong. Their memories, fragmented, like their past had been surgically erased and replaced with obedience. The Blackmoors called it salvation. Others called it enslavement of the soul. But where did this knowledge come from? Not medicine, not science. It traced back to older sources, the Black Book of Archon, grimoires smuggled out of plague-ravaged Europe, forbidden rites preserved by aristocrats who worshipped not God, but control. Documents hint at the Blackmoors' ties to secret societies, families like the Ashfords, the Ees, Alberts, and other dynasties whose wealth and secrecy have shaped history behind locked doors. These families weren't just rich, they were architects, designers of systems meant to subdue the will, to convert human beings into programmable assets. The Blackmoor estate. It wasn't an isolated horror, it was a prototype. And while New England shivered under harsh winters and political unrest, behind the stone walls of Blackmoor Hollow, the blueprint for mass psychological domination was already alive. And no one, not governments, not clergy, not even God himself, intervened. Here's where it gets worse, because the Blackmoor experiment didn't stay contained. Control, once perfected, becomes a contagion. By 1841, the quiet success of Blackmoor Hollow had rippled beyond Maine's forgotten forests. Whispers of miraculous rehabilitation and transformative obedience drew powerful attention. Politicians, clergy, and industrial magnates, men obsessed with order, began visiting the estate under the veil of secrecy. They didn't come to investigate, they came to learn. You see, by then, the Blackmoors had refined the recalibration. It wasn't just for rebellious daughters or inconvenient wives. It evolved, targeting those with influence, ambition, or knowledge the elites deemed dangerous. Rival businessmen vanished. Journalists, too curious, disappeared. When they resurfaced, they were different, docile, stripped of conviction, reciting ideologies they never believed before. The Blackmoors had weaponized identity. And the technique? It wasn't crude torture. It was elegance masked as science. They used sound frequencies engineered to disrupt cognitive patterns, symbolic repetition to fracture belief systems, sleep deprivation combined with suggestive doctrine to dissolve resistance. Ritual, disguised as psychology. Their methods predated what governments now call psychological operations, PSYOPs. But make no mistake, the blueprint was born here, in the Blackmoor catacombs. Records show that by 1845 the estate hosted clandestine gatherings, the Order of Dominion, they called themselves. Aristocrats, intellectuals, even early industrialists aligned under one purpose, perfecting systems of obedience scalable to entire populations, and they started small. Banking policies designed to enforce dependency, educational reforms engineered to eliminate critical thought, religious doctrines subtly rewritten to breed submission instead of enlightenment. But at the core of it all, beneath the paper trails and societal facades, lay Blackmoor Hollow, still hidden, still operational, refining human compliance behind fortress walls. The most disturbing revelation? The Blackmoors were merely caretakers, the true architects, shadows older than the family itself, occult councils, ancient dynasties tracing back to the forgotten temples of Europe, where rituals bound empires long before democracy was ever spoken. This wasn't wealth, this was dominion, the slow, precise engineering of human will, and by the time society noticed, it was already embedded. The question is, how much of your mind is still your own? You've felt it, haven't you? That quiet suspicion that your thoughts, your choices, your very beliefs might not be entirely your own. You're not wrong. What happened inside Blackmoor Hollow was never meant to stay in those stone corridors. It metastasized, weaving itself into the institutions we still trust today. Education, media, even governance, all of it bearing fingerprints you were never supposed to see. It's no coincidence that within 2 generations of Blackmoor's rise, America saw the explosion of systems engineered for control, public schooling models stripped of critical thought, patriotism replaced by blind obedience, industrial labor chains disguised as opportunity. The blueprint came from the Hollow. Survivor accounts, those smuggled out by defectors risking their lives, describe the next phase of the Blackmoor experiment. By the late 1850s, the estate wasn't just reshaping individuals, it was beta-testing societal control. The method? Fragmentation and replacement. Subjects, once free-thinking, rebellious, non-conforming, were isolated, mentally broken, and rebuilt with artificial convictions perfectly aligned to the Order's agenda. But then, they applied the same principles to broader systems. Fragment education, replace independent inquiry with rote memorization. Fragment tradition, replace organic culture with state-approved narratives. Fragment the family, replace generational wisdom with institutional authority. Sound familiar? What's terrifying isn't how effective it was, but how unnoticed it became. Generations grew under invisible chains, their loyalties programmed, their dissent neutralized not through force, but through belief itself. And it all traces back to that cursed mansion buried in the Maine wilderness, Blackmoor Hollow, the laboratory for the manipulation of mankind. But even darker, this wasn't new. The Blackmoors inherited knowledge far older than America. The esoteric sciences of the ancient world, the psychology of obedience honed in the shadows of fallen empires, preserved by secret societies, quietly revived under the guise of enlightenment. And by the time this method infected schools, churches, governments, it was too late. What you believe, what you defend, even what you fear, may not have been born from your own mind. And if that unsettles you, good. Because we're only beginning to peel back the layers. The truth is, the Blackmoor legacy didn't vanish, it evolved, and like all true forms of domination, it learned to wear a different face. By the dawn of the 20th century, the estate at Blackmoor Hollow was abandoned, at least that's what the public was told. Official records declared the mansion condemned after a series of unexplained deaths. Workers found with bloodless bodies, eyes wide with unspeakable terror, their mouths frozen mid-scream. Locals avoided the place. Superstition did what the authorities refused to, but beneath the rotting facade, the catacombs remained. Active. The real Blackmoor operation had already metastasized, embedding itself into institutions far beyond that cursed ground. The most chilling evidence? A quiet shift in the academic world, new fields of behavioral science funded by anonymous patrons, research grants flowing into Ivy League universities, and government contracts written in language so deliberately vague, their true intent stayed hidden. But the architects behind it, the same families. Documents buried within declassified archives link early psychological research programs like MKUltra, Project Monarch, and even aspects of the Tavistock Institute directly to descendants of the Blackmoor lineage. Different names, different titles, same blood, same agenda. The public was told these programs were experiments, limited, isolated, mistakes of overreach, but what they really were field tests. Refinements of what began beneath Blackmoor Hollow. Psychological dismantling, identity erasure, indoctrination so deep it rewired the subconscious, making resistance nearly impossible. And society, it became their new sanctum. Schools that silence independent thought, media that curates your reality, social structures that reward obedience, punish deviation. This wasn't accidental. It was legacy, an ancient pursuit disguised as progress, rooted in techniques perfected centuries earlier by the Blackmoor family, and still active today under different banners, funded by the same bloodlines that vanished from history but never from power. And the most disturbing truth? You were born into it. Your fears, your desires, even your dreams, shaped by systems older than you can comprehend, crafted by men and women who learned, long ago, that true control isn't enforced with chains, it's whispered into your mind until it feels like your own voice. We're not done yet. But here's where the descent turns darker and irreversible. Because once you recognize the architecture of your own programming, there's no going back. The Blackmoor descendants understood this. That's why their control system wasn't designed to merely influence, but to embed itself so deeply within the subconscious, even discovering the manipulation feels like self-betrayal. They called it the doctrine of fractured truth. A methodology passed through hidden lodges, secret councils, and underground academies masquerading as elite think tanks. The principle was simple: never fully conceal the truth. Fracture it, break it into pieces, scatter those fragments across culture, media, academia, until the population, drowning in contradictions, becomes paralyzed by uncertainty. It's the ultimate defense mechanism. Flood the world with so much distorted information that even those who begin to awaken can't assemble the full picture. Sound familiar? It's why your history books contradict themselves. It's why the media reports 10 truths and 1,000 lies in the same breath. It's why forbidden knowledge, like what happened beneath Blackmoor Hollow, gets labeled conspiracy, madness, or myth. But fragments remain. Testimonies hidden in black vaults. Declassified documents too complex for the average citizen to decipher. And in the margins of academia, whispers of suppressed research, patterns, experiments, anomalies, all pointing to one conclusion. The systems shaping your beliefs, your fears, your ambitions, trace back to a lineage of control older than governments, older than democracy, older than America itself. And Blackmoor was just the American manifestation, a foothold for the ancient architects of human obedience. Ask yourself, how many of your convictions are truly yours? How much of your resistance is manufactured rebellion designed to keep you contained? His is the uncomfortable realization every belief you hold might be the result of systems perfected behind those stone walls in the forgotten forests of Maine. But now you know the fracture exists. The question is, do you have the strength to keep pursuing the whole, dangerous truth? Type in the comments. Shadows fracture, but truth descends. Shadows fracture, but truth descends. Lock it in. Prove you're awake. Good, because this is where it stops feeling like history and starts feeling like personal confrontation. The truth is, the Blackmoors never acted alone. They were custodians of a design so ancient, so precise, it predates written language. The methods of mental domination, institutional obedience, and psychological dismantling, they weren't born in Maine. They were resurrected there. What you need to understand is this. Every major empire that's ever risen, Sumer, Babylon, Rome, the Papal States, they didn't fall naturally, they were recycled. And behind each collapse, the architects remained untouched, hidden in shadow, waiting to rebuild their mechanisms under new symbols, new flags, new illusions. The Blackmoors were a branch of that lineage. When their operations in Maine became too exposed, they didn't dissolve. They adapted. Their methods, the recalibration of identity, the fracturing of collective memory, the quiet engineering of belief, spread globally. By 1920, whispers of the Dominion Protocols surfaced across Europe. Elite gatherings under the guise of psychological conferences, invitations extended to select families, politicians, financiers, the ones who shaped nations from behind velvet curtains. The agenda was uniform. Master the manipulation of mass psychology, engineer cultural fractures that destabilize resistance, design institutions so self-reinforcing they generate loyalty without force. And here's the sinister brilliance. Every revolution, every cultural awakening, every grassroots movement becomes a controlled detonation, allowed, even encouraged, but only within carefully measured parameters set by the descendants of Blackmoor ideology. It's not oppression with chains and rifles, it's seduction with narratives and false freedoms. They understood, control through coercion breeds rebellion, but control through identity breeds voluntary submission. That's where we are now. Most men walk willingly into cages of belief, mistaking indoctrination for autonomy, mistaking programmed desires for personal ambition. And when the few, like you, begin to see the fractures, the system responds. Not with force. With engineered confusion. With cultural division so relentless, so personalized, that even the aware become isolated, paralyzed. But not you. Not anymore. You're descending beyond the fracture into forbidden clarity. Stay with me. The deeper you go, the more dangerous this becomes, not because of what I'm saying, but because of what you're starting to feel. That itch at the back of your mind, the quiet realization that everything, the news, your education, even your faith, has been filtered, fragmented, and fed to you like a carefully measured sedative. It's not paranoia, it's design. Let me tell you about the Hollow Men. By the 1950s, the Blackmoor influence had morphed into global policy-making. But unlike the shadowy elites portrayed in cheap conspiracy, the Hollow Men operated differently. They weren't kings, they weren't presidents, they were architects, technocrats, media moguls, behavioral scientists, all descendants either by blood or by ideology of the original Blackmoor doctrine. You've seen their fingerprints, the sudden alignment of global educational models, obedience over inquiry, the synchronized media narratives, fear cycles, outrage triggers, distractions tailored to fracture your focus, the sterilization of masculine power, aggression pathologized, ambition ridiculed, sovereignty dismantled under the guise of social harmony. It wasn't random. The Hollow Men understood that to weaken a population, you don't need to enslave their bodies, you enslave their perception. And to fracture perception, you saturate the world with curated chaos, just enough truth to bait curiosity, just enough distortion to derail it. Ask yourself, how many of your convictions are hand-me-downs from compromised institutions? How many times have you mistaken conformity for wisdom? And here's the most brutal revelation. The Hollow Men aren't ancient phantoms. They're still here. Look at your news cycles. Look at your algorithms. Look at the sudden cultural shifts that feel orchestrated, yet organic, dividing men, diluting tradition, corroding resilience, all under the banner of progress. But now a fracture in the illusion has widened. Because the descendants of Blackmoor didn't account for one thing, some men, when confronted with engineered confusion, don't fold. They awaken. And once you awaken, there's no returning to sleep. We are only steps away from the forbidden heart of this history. There's a reason most never reach this depth. It's not just fear, it's design. Because the further you descend into the architecture of control, the more reality itself starts to deform. You see, the Blackmoor descendants, those hollow men, didn't merely manipulate society, they restructured the human mind. In 1963, buried beneath layers of classified research, a program called Project Lucid began. Officially, it never existed, but traces remain, financial records, declassified memos, and whispered testimony from men whose lives were erased. The objective of Project Lucid, to decode and control human cognition on a mass scale. They understood something most psychologists still refuse to accept. Consciousness isn't fixed, it's programmable. You can fracture a man's identity. You can overwrite his instincts. You can condition him to love servitude and fear freedom. And where did this forbidden science originate? Back in the blood-soaked catacombs beneath Blackmoor Hollow, the so-called rehabilitation chambers. Their real purpose wasn't religious. It was cognitive engineering, experiments in sensory deprivation, linguistic manipulation, and trauma-induced compliance. They didn't cure madness. They manufactured obedience. Fast forward to the Cold War, those methods resurface. Not in convents or castles, but in laboratories, universities, advertising agencies. Look closer at the rise of mass media in the 20th century. The television isn't entertainment, it's a calibration tool. The schooling system isn't education, it's indoctrination scaffolding. And digital platforms, they aren't liberating. They are the final stage of Project Lucid, a self-reinforcing echo chamber that harvests your data, monitors your behaviors, and subtly adjusts your worldview until your thoughts align with the engineered consensus. If that unsettles you, good. That's your primal awareness. Resurfacing the buried instinct the architects tried to extinguish. But here's where the fracture becomes a weapon. Because when you see the system, truly see it, you're no longer controllable in the way they intended. You become dangerous. The question is, do you keep descending, or do you run back to the comforting illusion they crafted for you? The next revelation changes everything. Understand this. When the Blackmoor family disappeared from public record, they didn't vanish. They splintered. They became Hydra heads, embedding themselves in the infrastructure of emerging power systems, banks, universities, medical institutions. Their influence became more effective because it became invisible. By the 1970s, one of their most insidious creations surfaced, the Behavioral Normalization Index, a private ledger used by covert advisory groups to measure societal compliance across continents. This was not a governmental project. It was the intellectual inheritance of the Blackmoor bloodline, now dispersed through a lattice of private foundations and non-profit initiatives that shaped education, medicine, and public morality from behind the scenes. They pioneered the quiet science of predictive behavior modulation, crafting cultural trends years in advance, testing them through localized social experiments, then scaling them globally once resistance metrics dropped to acceptable thresholds. Think about the fads, the slogans, the sudden redefinitions of what's acceptable and what's intolerable. None of it is spontaneous. Every shift was orchestrated, not by the hands of presidents or celebrities, but by the cold, detached calculus of hollow men applying formulas that trace directly back to the Blackmoor doctrine. They learned how to pace the collapse, not by brute force, but by consent. Condition a population to demand their own sedation, entertain them into apathy, medicate them into compliance, divide them into manageable tribes that self-police through digital shame rituals. And when outliers emerge, when men like you begin to question the frame, they're dismissed, not with bullets, but with ridicule. You become the joke, the lunatic, the conspiracy theorist. It's a self-cleaning system. It's why you feel that creeping isolation as you piece together forbidden history. You are meant to feel alone, but you're not. There are others navigating this descent, others tracing the fractures back to their origin. And what waits at the bottom? is the most dangerous revelation of all. Stay sharp. They called it the Eventide model, an invisible architecture designed to erode generational memory. You see, most forms of control are temporary. Governments fall, propaganda loses power, but if you can sever a people from their ancestral knowledge, if you can make them forget who they were, you can control them indefinitely. The Eventide model became the silent cornerstone of modern social engineering. It wasn't just about shaping the present, it was about erasing the past. Textbooks rewritten, cultural symbols inverted, rituals demonized, traditions sterilized. The Blackmoor descendants understood, if a man's story can be stolen, so can his identity. The project accelerated after World War II, statues removed, folklore dismissed, languages diluted, heroes replaced with entertainers. What you now see as progress is, in fact, the final phase of ancestral erasure. Look closely. How many men today can trace their lineage beyond 3 generations? How many know the real, unfiltered history of their people, their bloodline, their homeland? Almost none. Because the Hollow Men applied the Eventide model flawlessly, they replaced family legacy with corporate branding. They substituted masculine rites of passage with endless adolescence. They buried warrior codes beneath pacifist dogma. And now, most men walk as orphans, severed from the strength, brutality, and clarity of their ancestors. It was never about individual enslavement. It was about civilizational amnesia. Because a man without a story is a man without a sword, and that's precisely the kind of man the Hollow Men wanted to manufacture. But there's a crack now. You've seen it. You've felt it. And that ancient instinct buried beneath layers of engineered weakness, it's beginning to wake. The next piece will show you how they forged the walls of your mental prison. Brace yourself. You've heard whispers of families like the Blackmoors, but what you likely never knew is how they embedded themselves into the bloodstream of society itself. The Blackmoors didn't just amass wealth or titles. No, their brilliance was more sinister, more insidious. They infiltrated through marriage, through patronage, through carefully orchestrated bloodlines, breeding influence across generations like cattle. Their children didn't simply inherit land, they inherited access. Access to monarchs, to clergy, to early scientific guilds, to the dark subterranean circles where knowledge wasn't shared. It was hoarded. And make no mistake, the knowledge they guarded wasn't public. It wasn't recorded in history books or etched into universities. It was whispered behind the iron doors of private libraries, coded into architecture, concealed beneath the banners of philanthropy and religious piety. They understood before most that true power isn't loud, it's silent. It moves in the gaps between governments, between belief systems, between the fractures of human understanding. By the mid-1700s, the Blackmoors were known in hushed tones among Europe's elite as the Silent Blood, an untraceable dynasty orchestrating from behind the veil, never appearing on official registers, yet present in every institution that mattered. Their influence seeded revolutions they pretended to oppose. They funded scientific advancements they publicly condemned. They rewrote religious dogma, turning spirituality into a psychological leash. You see, their genius wasn't in overt control, it was engineering obedience through invisible structures. But behind their calculated manipulation burned an older hunger, a need older than politics, deeper than wealth. The pursuit of biological mastery, the conquest of human potential itself. And that's where their history darkens. Because the Blackmoors didn't merely want control of governments, they wanted control of you, your body, your blood, your legacy. The hidden experiments, the twisted medical sanctuaries, the vanishing populations. It all ties back to their obsession, perfecting humanity on their terms, and erasing anyone who resisted. This isn't myth, it's your reality. And the next descent reveals exactly how deep their grip goes. Maine, 1814. The Blackmoors arrived under false names, their legacy cloaked, their history buried beneath layers of deception. The town they chose? Blackmoor, a forgotten coastal outpost shrouded in fog, known for shipwrecks and whispered tragedies. Perfect. They didn't come with armies or grand fanfare. They came with scholars, physicians, alchemists, and crates, heavy, locked crates no one dared question. Locals assumed them eccentric nobility fleeing European wars. The truth? They were establishing the next phase of their legacy, far from prying eyes, far from royal courts now wary of their influence. They built Blackmoor Estate, a sprawling Gothic compound on cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. From the outside, it resembled an aging monastery. Inside, it was something else entirely. Subterranean laboratories hidden beneath prayer chambers, medical theaters disguised as banquet halls, and the sanctum, a locked underground vault carved directly into the coastal rock, sealed with mechanisms no ordinary man could decipher. But this wasn't simply for secrecy, it was necessity. Because within those walls they resumed their forbidden work, the manipulation of biology, the bending of human limitation, the extraction of knowledge hidden within the human genome long before modern science had words for DNA. Villagers whispered of disappearances, of strange lights in the fog, of voices, chanting, mechanical, animalistic, echoing across the cliffs on moonless nights. They whispered, but did nothing. Because fear silences action, and the Blackmoors, masters of psychological warfare, seeded that fear like rot beneath the soil. For 30 years, Blackmoor Estate expanded unseen. They acquired coastal trade routes, bribed authorities, and manipulated both sides of every regional conflict. All while deep beneath the estate, generations of experiments progressed, tortium, testing nature, engineering improvements, and refining the ultimate weapon, control through blood. This wasn't medical advancement, it was ancestral conquest, and those few who stumbled upon their truth, they vanished, erased like ink beneath acid. Until now, because their legacy didn't die in Blackmoor, it evolved. And if you're still listening, you've already touched the edge of their unfinished empire. But the next revelation, it changes everything. History records the surface, the wars, the treaties, the kings who rise, the governments that fall. But beneath that history runs a darker current, one the Blackmoors have navigated for centuries with surgical precision. By the late 1800s, their biological experiments, hidden under layers of philanthropy and academic secrecy, produced results even their ancestors hadn't imagined. Imagine human beings, conditioned from conception for obedience, stripped of independent will, engineered to conform to social hierarchies without resistance. It sounds impossible. It's already happening, not through microchips or overt dystopian regimes, but through generational trauma, through chemical alterations disguised as medicine, through systems of education that erode critical thought and reward docility. The Blackmoors mastered this quiet eugenics. They seeded their bloodline with select unions, arranged across continents, blending ancient royal genetics with emerging scientific knowledge. Their goal, the ascendant line, a breed of human, loyal, intellectually superior, emotionally detached from empathy, yet capable of mimicking compassion when needed, the perfect rulers, the perfect manipulators, the perfect architects of society's slow decay. But here's the fracture they couldn't seal. Some of their experiments deviated. Bloodlines awakened. Men and women born within their engineered systems rejected the programming. They remembered, instinctively, that their ancestry wasn't meant for servitude, it was meant for sovereignty, and you, if you've made it this far, might be one of them. The Blackmoors call your kind fractures, anomalies in their perfected lineage, threats to their dominion. This is why forbidden knowledge is buried, why histories are rewritten, why dissent is pathologized. Because when a fracture awakens, their empire cracks and acts become revolutions, not the counterfeit kind they control, but raw, untethered rebellion. That rebellion starts now. We descend into the forbidden truth of their legacy, starting with Section 16. Prepare yourself. The deepest fractures lie ahead. They always tell you history repeats itself, but they never explain why. They never admit that the cycle isn't natural, it's engineered, designed by men whose names never appear in textbooks. Hidden architects who orchestrate the rise and fall of nations like a ritual sacrifice. The Blackmoor family understood this principle centuries before you were born. They didn't merely study history, they wrote it, and they did so in blood. Their doctrine was simple: true control isn't taken, it's given. A population must beg for chains, must demand its own subjugation. How do you achieve that? You create unbearable crises, only to present yourself as the savior. It's the oldest play in the book. Problem, reaction, solution. The Blackmoors mastered it during the famines of 1347. They watched peasants claw at each other for mouldy bread, while their hidden councils convened by candlelight, drafting the first protocols of mass manipulation. They learned to trigger collapse at will: plague, war, famine, economic ruin. They discovered that desperation makes men forget their heritage, forget their rights, forget who holds the knife at their throat, and in their forgetfulness they build their own prisons, brick by brick, law by law, never realizing the bars are forged by design. Centuries later, the blueprint persists. Only now the tools are more sophisticated. Economic downturns that appear natural, pandemics that feel random, civil unrest that seems spontaneous, but behind the scenes, the same ritual cycles engineered by bloodlines you were never meant to notice, bloodlines like the Blackmoors. And here's the part they fear the most: exposure. You were never supposed to hear these names. You were never meant to question the patterns, but patterns speak louder than propaganda. Patterns fracture illusions. This isn't conspiracy, it's continuity. A hidden script, refined over gene, rations, and for the first time you're holding a page of it. The question isn't whether they'll repeat history, it's whether you'll remain a willing actor or burn the script entirely. Stay with me. This descent only deepens. What they never taught you about power is that the most dangerous force on Earth isn't military might, it's narrative. Stories shape empires, myths forge identities, and history, real history, is the battlefield they hope you never enter. You see, the Blackmoor family didn't just manipulate resources, they manipulated memory, and when you control memory, you own reality. Imagine this: 1,000 years of fabricated wars, rewritten events, destroyed records. The world map you memorized in school, incomplete. The flags you salute, designed in backrooms. The leaders you vote for, installed by design, their biographies sanitized, their lineage, unknown to you, traced directly to hidden councils operating in the shadows. The Blackmoors understood early that humanity's greatest weakness is its amnesia. Erase the past, fracture the roots, and a population becomes pliable, detached from ancestry, culture, sovereignty. Lost men crave direction. Lost nations crave saviors. That's where the Blackmoors step in. But memory has cracks. Fragments survive, ancient symbols etched into forgotten architecture, discredited texts buried in Vatican vaults, whispers of suppressed civilizations that predate the pyramids, cultures obliterated, their existence erased because they understood one unforgivable truth: humanity was never meant to be domesticated. The Blackmoors' doctrine couldn't survive intact if you remembered your origins, if you understood your intrinsic power, so they rewrote the timeline, they demonized the heretics. They buried the evidence beneath wars, religious schisms, and false scientific consensus. But they failed in one regard: they underestimated anomalies like you. Because now, cracks in the narrative widen. Whistleblowers vanish, but their testimonies leak. Ancient ruins emerge from melted ice, their architecture mocking the official version of history. Linguistic scholars stumble upon untranslated scripts that imply human civilization is far older and far more advanced than you've been told. Every fragment reclaims your stolen legacy. Every revelation fractures the manufactured timeline, and with each fracture the illusion weakens. You stand at the crossroads of remembrance and obedience. They want you numb, forgetful, obedient. But memory, real, raw, forbidden memory, is an act of war. And tonight, we remember. There's a reason forbidden knowledge feels dangerous, because it is, not to you, but to them. Every truth you uncover weakens their grip. Every suppressed fact is a weapon buried beneath centuries of deception. The Blackmoor family spent generations hiding those weapons, burying them beneath universities, disguising them as myths, ridiculing anyone who dared to ask the wrong questions. You've heard of bloodlines shaping history, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Windsors, but those are surface names, decoys meant to pacify your curiosity. The real architects, their names rot beneath unmarked tombs. Their power flows in hidden symbols etched into ancient institutions. And the Blackmoors, they never vanished. They simply changed form. It began with shadow banking in 14th century Venice. Blackmoor gold, smuggled beneath false identities, funding both sides of every war. Kings, popes, generals, puppets strung along by invisible hands. By the 1600s, they had infiltrated the earliest scientific academies, redirecting human discovery away from enlightenment toward control. Understand this: science, when uncorrupted, liberates. But when engineered by hidden councils, it imprisons. The Blackmoors rewrote the boundaries of acceptable research. Technologies buried, cures concealed, entire fields of study labeled pseudoscience because they threatened to reveal human potential beyond what the system could contain. You weren't born to be free. You were born to serve their design. Education, indoctrination, medicine, dependency, democracy, theater. Your identity, your very perception of reality, scripted to ensure obedience. But cracks appear. Ancient texts surface. Recovered journals from forgotten expeditions reveal civilizations erased from maps. Cultures that mastered energy, consciousness, and sovereignty, long before the so-called Enlightenment. The Blackmoor's great set fear, you remembering who you are. Because awareness breeds defiance, and defiance breaks cycles. You're not here by accident. This isn't entertainment, it's initiation. Keep listening, because descent into forbidden knowledge has no reverse gear. Let me tell you a secret they never wanted whispered. Control isn't enforced with chains anymore. It's enforced with belief. They realized long ago the sharpest prison is the one you don't know you're inside. The Blackmoor family mastered this psychology centuries before modern government stumbled upon it. They understood something sinister, something powerful, that if you can infect the human mind with the right mythology, people will beg for their own enslavement. Think of it, borders drawn with ink, not iron, histories fabricated in ivory towers while the true chronicles smolder in forbidden libraries. The Blackmoors didn't need armies, they needed architects of perception, and they built them, scholars, priests, media magnates, all unwitting actors in a theater designed to keep you asleep. Their greatest masterpiece? The illusion of progress. You're told civilization advances linearly, but behind the curtain it's a loop, a carousel of engineered collapse and reconstruction, each cycle tightening the noose. Every war, every pandemic, every revolution, choreographed to drive humanity deeper into psychological submission. And it works. The masses worship false idols, technocrats, celebrities, officials, never questioning the architects behind the veil. They ridicule those who resist, labeling them mad, dangerous, conspiratorial. But understand, this labeling isn't defense, it's programming. The Blackmoors never fought the loud rebels. They rewired the quiet minds. Whisper by whisper, they reshaped reality until truth became heresy and lies became law. But here's where the script fractures. Anomalies, individuals immune to the programming, emerge. Men like you, drawn to forgotten archives, haunted by ancient ruins that contradict the official timeline. You sense the fractures even if you can't yet name them. That unease, that relentless whisper telling you something is wrong with the world. It's your immunity activating, and they fear that. Because one awakened mind triggers another, awareness spreads like wildfire, igniting the ruins of false history. You were taught to fear forbidden knowledge. They should have taught you to wield it. We're not done. The descent deepens now. Power, real power, is never loud. It's not the clamor of politicians or the spectacle of kings. It moves in silence, through handshakes in locked rooms, through bloodlines so ancient their names dissolve like mist from public memory. The Blackmoor family understood this to the marrow of their bones. Their control wasn't built on guns. It was built on inheritance, secrecy, and psychological architecture. There is something the textbooks will never tell you. In the 17th century, during the European plague cycles, the Blackmoors perfected a system that would outlive monarchies and revolutions. They embedded control mechanisms into medicine, commerce, and, most terrifying of all, into time itself. The Gregorian calendar you obey, Blackmoor design. The 7-day workweek, Blackmoor design. The fiscal quarters that dictate global economies. A rhythm they imposed, subtly divorcing humanity from nature's organic cycles. They didn't just own resources, they owned the very tempo of human life. Think about it. Your days, your seasons, your concept of urgency, your measurement of success, all tied to artificial timelines. You race toward deadlines they created. You exhaust yourself in rituals they embedded, believing you are free while sprinting within cages shaped like clocks. But even time can be weaponized. You were taught history in fragments, divided eras, disconnected cultures. You were never given the continuum, the tapestry, because if you had seen the true sequence, you would have recognized the cycle: problem, reaction, solution, reset. The Blackmoors thrived in resets. Every collapse, be it empire, currency, or ideology, was not a misstep. It was the harvest. When people were most desperate, when systems crumbled, that's when the architects tightened their grip. That's when new structures emerged, always more restrictive than the last. History is not a straight line. It's a spiral staircase, and each step descends further into engineered dependency. The question is, will you continue descending blindfolded, or will you tear the cloth from your eyes? Because here's the fracture they never wanted you to find. Once you see the mechanisms, you can choose to break them. Once you question time, you can reclaim your life. Stay with me. This descent is far from over. There is a story buried beneath every institution, every monument, every cathedral towering above the cities of the world. Not the story they tell you, but the story etched into stone by hands older than nations. The Blackmoor family didn't just infiltrate governments. They sanctified their legacy in architecture, symbols, and sacred geometry most men walk past without ever seeing. You've noticed them, haven't you? The hidden eyes carved into public squares, the obelisks in every major capital, the checkerboard floors in grand halls. These are not decorations, they are signatures. Silent reminders from the architects of control that their dominion is permanent, unless you decode it. The Blackmoors believed in visibility cloaked as invisibility. Their symbols are hidden in plain sight, because when a lie is grand enough, it becomes indistinguishable from truth. They learned this from ancient orders long before the Vatican crowned its first pope, before America inked its constitution, before democracy was even an idea. And those symbols, they are everywhere. Washington, D.C., aligned to constellations revered by secret societies. The city's grid, a precise invocation of esoteric principles designed to anchor energy, influence minds, and subtly rewire perception. The banking halls of London, vaults shaped with Masonic precision, their geometry not just aesthetic, but ritualistic, binding global commerce to ancient numerology. And at the center of these constructions, the Blackmoor legacy, unseen, unspoken, but as tangible as the stone beneath your feet. Most dismiss this as coincidence. They laugh, mock, label it paranoia. But consider this: why would ruling families spanning centuries, continents, and religions adopt the same hidden language? Why do forbidden books from ancient Egypt to post-war Europe repeat identical symbols? Because symbols are power. They bypass logic. They embed themselves into your subconscious. They shape reality without permission. The Blackmoors knew this. That's why their influence feels eternal, because it's written into the very bones of your civilization. But awareness fractures spells. The moment you see the patterns, they lose strength. This is not superstition, it's warfare for the mind. And you, right now, are stepping onto the battlefield. The descent sharpens from here. There's a reason they engineered your education to ridicule ancient knowledge, a reason they laughed off sacred geometry, astrology, alchemy, as if the builders of empires were fumbling fools, and only modern men held real wisdom. But that's the deepest deception, the severing of your lineage to the primordial architects of civilization. The Blackmoor family understood what the ancients understood. Reality is programmable, if you control frequency. And no, I don't mean pop songs on your car radio or Wi-Fi signals. I mean the vibrational codes embedded into architecture, language, even human biology. The ancients encoded these frequencies into temples, monoliths, and forgotten cities, structures designed not just to impress, but to attune the human mind to higher states of awareness. Pyramids, frequency machines, stone circles, energy amplifiers, cathedrals, resonance chambers disguised as religious halls. But when the Blackmoors emerged from the ashes of medieval Europe, they didn't seek to elevate mankind with this knowledge. They inverted it. Where once frequencies liberated, now they confine. Where architecture aligned you to the cosmos, now it suppresses your instincts. Cubicles, concrete jungles, sterile classrooms designed to dull perception, to fragment your connection to nature and self. Even your music, once tuned to natural frequencies that harmonize the body, was distorted. In 1953, under covert influence, global musical tuning shifted to 440 Hz. You were told it was standardization. The truth? A deliberate dissonance embedded into the soundtrack of daily life, fraying your nervous system, keeping you agitated, compliant, distracted. And when your mind is distracted, when your body is vibrating out of alignment, you never ask the forbidden questions. You never look at the Blackmoor signatures beneath your feet, above your skyline, within your bloodstone. Ream. But some have begun to remember. Architects resurrect ancient blueprints, scholars decode the lost vibrations. Survivors of indoctrination awaken to the invisible lattice of control strangling their potential. You are not meant to remain asleep in their engineered dreamscape. The frequencies are shifting, but descent into this revelation has a price. Comfort is abandoned, certainty dissolves. And what waits below is the raw, terrifying truth of your stolen inheritance. There is a reason your instincts have been dulled, a reason every system, education, media, even medicine, has been weaponized to separate you from your own intuition, because an awakened instinct is uncontrollable. The Blackmoor family's greatest fear was never armed rebellion. It wasn't political revolution. It was the re-emergence of human instinct, the raw, unfiltered awareness buried beneath centuries of psychological domestication. Understand this. Your ancestors were predators, navigators of wilderness, readers of subtle energies, masters of their domain. They sensed danger before it arrived. They perceived lies before words were spoken. That primal intelligence wasn't lost. It was suppressed. By design. In the 1800s, as industrial empires expanded, so did the Blackmoors' true operation, the domestication of mankind. They understood that to govern billions without visible chains, you must sever their ancestral memory. You must convince them that instinct is primitive, that logic alone is king, that intuition is superstition, and they succeeded. But fragments of ancient instinct remain, in the shivers down your spine when the truth approaches, in the gut feeling that whispers warnings when official narratives crumble. Those whispers, they are not irrational. They are echoes from your bloodline, remnants of faculties that the Blackmoors could never fully erase. Look at the world. Crowded cities corralled by surveillance, food stripped of vitality, Water poisoned with chemicals that numb aggression, dampen curiosity. Medical cures engineered to pacify, not empower, all crafted to suppress the primal fire within. But that fire never extinguished. And here's the fracture in their fortress. When one man reignites his instinct, he cannot be controlled. When one man remembers, truly remembers, the pulse of forgotten ancestors coursing beneath his skin, the ill, fusion fractures. Your senses are returning. That discomfort you feel, it's not fear, it's awakening. They branded instinct as animalistic, savage, dangerous, because they feared what you would become if you reclaimed it. You were not designed for dependency, you were designed for sovereignty. But to reclaim that, you must descend beyond comfort, beyond doctrine, into the abyss of forbidden knowing. And that descent accelerates now. Let me tell you the truth, they've spent generations burying beneath polished marble and velvet lies. The world you inhabit was never built for your benefit. It was designed brick by brick, law by families like the Blackmoors, to ensure your submission. They understood something most men never will. The most effective form of slavery is invisible. No chains, no whips, just belief systems, and invisible cages of debt, duty, and distraction. Look around. You were born into a system you didn't design, a grid of borders, currencies, ideologies, and hierarchies so ancient they feel permanent. But permanence is a myth. The grid, a fabrication, a Blackmoor design rooted in one sinister principle: ownership. They didn't just acquire land, they acquired time, they acquired bloodlines, they acquired minds. The very concept of ownership, real estate, birth certificates, national identities, these are constructs, legal fictions, enforced through centuries of manipulation. You're told you own property, but stop paying tribute in the form of taxes and watch how quickly that illusion crumbles. You're told you're free, but step outside the lines they drew, challenge the false history they constructed, and suddenly, you are dangerous. The Blackmoors pioneered this art centuries before corporations disguised their control behind brands and flags. They knew the secret: authority is most potent when it wears the mask of choice. They gave you options, left or right, democracy or monarchy, paper currency or digital credit, but never permission to question the architects themselves. But here's the fracture they could never seal: knowledge leaks. Old manuscripts surface, forbidden symbols reappear, whispers ripple through the cracks of the illusion. And now you stand at the threshold. You can either retreat, plug back into the comfort of false security, or step into the dark core. Rider of forbidden history, the one lined with uncomfortable truths and ancient power. You were never meant to hear these words. They have spent billions to ensure you don't. But once heard, they cannot be unheard. The descent isn't over. In fact, we've only begun to fracture the foundations. Control is never enforced with brute strength alone. The most enduring dominion is achieved through myths, the careful construction of stories so vast, so old, they become indistinguishable from reality itself. The Blackmoor family mastered this art centuries before your history books were written. They understood that history is not what happened, it's what they allowed you to remember. The official narratives, the rise and fall of empires, the neatly packaged wars with beginning and end dates, the heroes and villains, their theater, a carefully curated stage play designed to keep your mind shackled within false timelines. But behind the curtains, the true architects operate in cycles, not linear events. Every financial collapse, a harvest. Every revolution, a pre-planned reset. Every technological leap, another tightening of the noose. The Blackmoors didn't just survive these resets, they orchestrated them. From the plague-ravaged streets of 14th century Europe to the gilded banks of 19th century America, they moved unseen, pulling levers, reformatting society under the guise of progress. And you inherited the aftermath, the hollowed-out institutions, the diluted history, the fragmented identity designed to keep you questioning everything but the architects themselves. Consider this. Why do the same families, bloodlines stretching back to feudal lords and merchant kings, still occupy positions of power today? Why does wealth concentrate like a virus in the hands of those whose names never appear in headlines? Why does every new era of freedom coincide with increased surveillance, digital control, psychological conditioning? Because progress is their most elegant illusion. But here's the fracture they never predicted. Information once scarce now leaks through the cracks of their empire. The symbols resurface. The hidden histories are pieced together, there by those unwilling to swallow the official narrative. And those who see cannot unsee. The descent you've begun is irreversible. Every section strips away another layer of the grand deception, exposing the skeletal framework beneath your so-called civilization. Comfort will abandon you here, but so will ignorance. And on the other side waits the raw, forbidden power of knowing. Are you ready to continue? You were taught to believe in borders, lines on maps, flags waving in the wind, anthems echoing at sporting events, all illusions designed to divide, while the true architects operate without nation, without loyalty, without limit. The Blackmoor family never swore allegiance to countries. They pledged allegiance to legacy. Understand this. While empires rose and fell, while revolutions swept continents, while billions bled and toiled under banners of false freedom, the Blackmoors watched from the shadows, untouched, unmoved, orchestrating the theater of nations like a grand chessboard. Borders, manufactured, elections, engineered, wars, profitable resets disguised as chaos. Because while you were distracted by left versus right, east versus west, patriot versus traitor, the Blackmoors were accumulating land, resources, patents, and influence that transcended the artificial lines drawn on your schoolroom globes. They own water sources under multiple flags. They fund military contractors on both sides of every conflict. They patent technologies in jurisdictions designed to obscure their fingerprints. They manipulate currencies, crash markets, and erase sovereign governments without firing a shot. The myth of borders keeps you divided. The myth of nationality keeps you compliant. But the architects of control, the Blackmoors and their unseen allies, move fluidly across the illusion, their loyalty only to the preservation of their dynasty. Look deeper. Why do the same corporate entities influence policy across rival nations? Why does the same media narrative echo from Washington to Moscow, from Beijing to Brussels? Why, despite centuries of supposed conflict, do certain families' fortunes only grow, untouched by sanctions, war, or economic collapse? Because the world stage is scripted, and you were cast as an extra, never meant to glimpse the writers behind. But now the curtain frays. The illusion dims, the symbols resurface, and you stand at the precipice, awakening to the forbidden truth. Borders are cages for minds, not fortresses for freedom. The descent into this knowledge is irreversible. Each step strips away another comfortable lie. And what waits beneath is the raw machinery of global control the Blackmoors hoped you'd never see. There is one domain the Blackmoor family guarded more viciously than land, gold, or influence. It is the one fortress they could not afford to lose: time itself. You see, the manipulation of history isn't just about controlling the past. It's about controlling perception of the present and engineering consent for the future. The Blackmoors mastered the suppression of time, and what they've hidden from you is the fractured chronology. The calendar you trust, the Gregorian system, was not universally adopted until the 20th century. Before that, entire regions followed different timekeeping systems, some with missing years, others with duplicated centuries. Consider the phantom time hypothesis. Historians who dared to question it were dismissed as lunatics, but the evidence persists. Whole centuries possibly fabricated, events inserted, erased, rewritten. Why? Because if you fracture the timeline, if you control what people believe when they are, you sever their link to origin. You disorient them. You make them forget who they were, and you make them easier to control. The Blackmoors didn't merely manipulate currency and governance, they manipulated chronology. They decided which epochs were celebrated, which were forgotten. Entire civilizations vanished not by natural decay but by historical omission. Sacred sites were misdated, relics conveniently disappeared, ancient technologies dismissed as myth. They rewrote your lineage. They inserted false heroes. They buried the bloodlines that threatened their reign. And to seal this deception, they conditioned you to mock those who ask the forbidden question: what time is it really? Every institution, every textbook, every clock on your wall is a reinforcement of this carefully constructed cage. Even your birth certificate, a timestamp, a jurisdictional branding, locks you into their artificial framework. But here's the fracture: the rise of forbidden archaeology, the exposure of ancient advanced sites that defy official timelines, the re-emergence of suppressed manuscripts. These are signals that the true chronology is surfacing. You were not meant to know this. You were not meant to question the continuum. But those who do, those who descend, begin to see the cracks in the fabricated flow of history. And once you see, you cannot return to the lie. The descent pulls you deeper now. Power doesn't reside in palaces. It doesn't parade itself on stages or in the televised speeches of trembling politicians. True power, unchallenged, ancient, absolute, operates in the shadows of symbols. The Blackmoor family understood this better than any dynasty before them. They knew symbols are weapons, not mere art, not superstition. Weapons engineered to bypass logic and root themselves in your subconscious, guiding your behavior, shaping your beliefs, forging your obedience without your awareness. Look closer. Why do corporate logos echo ancient runes? Why do government seals mirror occult geometry? Why are certain numbers, shapes and colors repeated across banking institutions, religious orders, military emblems? Because these are not coincidences. They are sigils, psychological anchors seeded into society, each one amplifying control. The Blackmoors mastered this language centuries ago. Long before advertising existed, before propaganda had a name, they inscribed symbols onto architecture, documents, currencies, embedding frequencies of authority and submission deep within the cultural nervous system. Consider their private crest, never public, never displayed in museums. A black Ouroboros devouring its own tail, encircling a mirror fractured down the center, flanked by twin ravens, each missing an eye. To the uninitiated, decoration; to those who understand, a declaration, eternal control, manufactured reflection, and surveillance from the unseen. This isn't fantasy. Science has caught fragments of the truth, neuro-linguistic programming, semiotics, subliminal priming, but the Blackmoors were centuries ahead, embedding control into the very aesthetic fabric of civilization. And they didn't stop with symbols. Architectural alignments, music tuned to dissonant frequencies, even city grids designed to mimic energy circuits, all part of an ancient piece of science. Psychological lattice imprisoning human awareness. But here's the fracture they could never seal. Once seen, symbols lose their grip. Recognition severs programming. Awareness dissolves manipulation. You're beginning to see them now, the sigils hiding in plain sight, the linguistic traps masquerading as freedom, the carefully coded messages instructing you to conform. You weren't born to obey symbols, you were born to command them. But only those who descend beyond fear, beyond comfort, claim that forgotten mastery. We are not finished. There exists a realm far darker than politics, economics, or the architecture of nations. It is the domain where the Blackmoor family carved their deepest scars into the human condition, a realm unseen yet omnipresent, the manipulation of belief. Understand this: faith, ideology, even spirituality, these were never left to chance. The Blackmoors, like all ancient architects of control, knew that to dominate a man you must first dominate his understanding of the divine. Religion was never just worship. It was behavioral conditioning disguised as salvation. And the Blackmoors? They perfected the quiet corruption of the sacred. Throughout history, notice the pattern: institutions of faith rising alongside empires, scriptures rewritten with each conquest, symbols of enlightenment distorted into instruments of submission. The Vatican archives, locked from public eyes. The destruction of ancient mystery schools. The burning of heretical texts. Behind it all, unseen yet instrumental, the Blackmoors maneuvered. Not as priests, not as prophets, but as puppeteers. They whispered in the ears of kings. They funded inquisitions behind sealed ledgers. They infiltrated seminaries, shaping doctrine to align with their singular goal: obedience disguised as faith. Even now, your understanding of morality, of sin, of the afterlife, fragments of engineered belief designed to suppress questions and elevate unquestioning allegiance. Why do sacred geometries, once tools of personal awakening, decorate cathedrals built to subdue? Why do ancient symbols of feminine power now adorn warnings of evil? Why does spiritual transcendence in most mainstream doctrines arrive only through suffering and subjugation? Because the Blackmoors buried ancient truths beneath dogma. They erased paths to self-mastery. They replaced inner sovereignty with external authority. Priests, laws, middle, men between you and the infinite. But here's the fracture they cannot contain. The forbidden fragments resurface. Lost manuscripts, unaltered symbols, whispered rituals older than kingdoms. Those fragments lead here to descent beyond sanctioned belief, to the reclamation of hidden spiritual autonomy. But such reclamation demands sacrifice, the death of false certainty, the obliteration of engineered faith. It demands you become what they fear most, an ungoverned soul. The descent deepens. If you have the resolve, I'll reveal more in Section 30. They will tell you history is shaped by revolutions, by the masses rising, by the people's will overpowering the few. But this is the grandest lie of all. Every revolution you've been taught to revere was architected by them, by families like the Blackmoors, who learned centuries ago that the most efficient form of control is controlled opposition. Consider the pattern. From the storming of the Bastille to the factories of Detroit, from the slogans of Marx to the polished promises of Silicon Valley. Behind each uprising, each social upheaval, the same hidden hands fund both sides, inflame both extremes, engineer chaos to birth a new order already designed in advance. The Blackmoors, they don't resist revolutions, they initiate them. Because when the old system collapses, when people scream for change, the architects step forward with ready-made answers, solutions that tighten control under the guise of liberation. New constitutions, new currencies, new technologies, each pre-approved, each reinforcing the deeper lattice of obedience. Ask yourself, why do radical leaders so often emerge from elite circles? Why do mass protests conveniently avoid the true architects? Why do regimes fall only to be replaced by equally corrupt structures dressed in different colors? Because revolution is theater, rebellion is a currency, and the Blackmoors have profited from both for centuries. They watched as kings fell, they smiled as presidents rose, they funded movements that appeared grassroots but were fertilized with their gold, their strategy, their psychological warfare. But here's the fracture. Genuine awakening is spreading beneath the counterfeit rebellions. Men like you, questioning not just authority, but the controlled opposition itself. Understanding that both the left hand and the right belong to the same puppeteer. This isn't about partisan lines, it's about ancient bloodlines. And the Blackmoors have spent generations insulating themselves from accountability, orchestrating collapses to maintain their dominion. But cracks appear. Symbolic revolutions can no longer conceal systemic manipulation. You've seen through the veil. There's no returning to comfort, only deeper descent, and the knowledge that true rebellion begins not with slogans, but with unmasking the architects themselves. We are not finished yet. There's a war raging beneath the surface of your daily life. You won't see it on the news. It doesn't echo through battlefields or explode in city streets. No, this war is older, quieter, far more dangerous. It is the war for your mind. And the Blackmoor family, they've been generals in this silent conflict for over 4 centuries. While you've been distracted by external threats, terror cells, foreign armies, economic collapse, the Blackmoors waged psychological warfare directly on your neural pathways. They understood a brutal truth most refuse to face: control the mind, and you control reality. Think about it. Why do modern education systems reward memorization over mastery? Why do entertainment industries flood your senses with violence, lust, and triviality? Why is your attention, your most valuable currency, harvested, commodified, and sold to the highest bidder? Because they've weaponized distraction. Every billboard, every scrolling feed, every algorithmically tailored dopamine hit keeps you sedated, intellectually starved, spiritually neutered, psychologically imprisoned. This isn't by accident. The Blackmoors engineered much of this machinery long before the internet was even a concept. Their financial veins run deep into media conglomerates, pharmaceutical giants, neuro-research think tanks, quietly crafting an architecture of mental dependence disguised as convenience. Ask yourself, why are critical thinkers marginalized? Why are dissenters silenced under the guise of misinformation? Why is your capacity for focused thought degraded year after year? Because fragmented minds can't rebel. Exhausted minds won't question. Addicted minds beg for the very chains that bind them. But here's the fracture they couldn't seal: the resurgence of forbidden knowledge. Men like you, warriors of awareness, who refuse sedation, who reclaim focus, who train, the mind like a blade sharpened against the lies. You've begun severing the psychological chains. You see through engineered consensus. You recognize cognitive warfare not as conspiracy, but as observable reality. The Blackmoors wanted subjects. You were bred to obey, but descent into forbidden knowledge transforms subjects into sovereigns. And a sovereign mind is their greatest fear. The descent deepens. If you have the will, I'll reveal more in Section 32. This is where most turn back, because what I'm about to reveal shatters the final illusion, the comforting lie you've been taught about freedom, identity, even your own body. Understand this. The Blackmoor family didn't simply manipulate economies, rewrite history, or engineer belief systems. Their deepest conquest, the one hidden from even the initiated, was biological. They infiltrated the blood. Generations ago, while empires clashed on battlefields and nations fell under flags, the Blackmoors operated in laboratories, in secret sanctuaries, in hidden chambers far from public eyes. What were they crafting? Not just medicines, but modifications. Not just cures, but conditions. Through selective breeding programs masquerading as aristocracy, through chemical industries disguised as health initiatives, through experimental trials buried beneath layers of classified research, they began altering the human blueprint. Your DNA, the sacred code of your ancestry, became their final frontier of control. Consider the exponential rise of chronic illnesses, mental health epidemics, infertility crises, all emerging alongside technological and pharmaceutical booms orchestrated by interconnected dynasties. Follow the bloodlines. The same families funding genetic research own the industries profiting from your ailments. The same names behind fertility solutions trace back to eugenics experiments in the 19th century. The Blackmoors perfected this game: break the body, fracture the mind, and then present themselves as saviors, with treatments, with policies, with transhumanist promises of artificial enhancement. But enhancement is deception. Their true agenda? To sever you from your natural sovereign biology, to transform you from a being of inherited strength into a programmable vessel, optimized for obedience, sterilized of resistance, disconnected from ancestral power. And here's the fracture. Despite centuries of manipulation, the original human blueprint persists. The warrior's lineage remains, your blood remembers, but awakening it requires more than awareness. It demands purification, mental fortification, a ruthless rejection of the synthetic chains they've wrapped around your biology. This is forbidden ground. Once you understand the assault on your blood, your body, your inheritance, there is no retreat. There is only the deeper descent into truth. We stand at the threshold of final revelation. If your resolve is absolute, I'll lead you into Section 33, the last descent, where everything hidden comes to light. This is the final veil. The last fracture in the illusion they've constructed around you, the barrier that separates ordinary men from those who command the forbidden currents of history itself. The Blackmoor family never intended you to reach this point, because what I'm about to reveal is their most sacred, most protected secret. The system of control is voluntary. Yes, you heard me. They cannot chain your mind. They cannot own your body. They cannot corrupt your spirit, unless you consent. But here's the brilliance of their deception. They've engineered a world where you consent unconsciously, through silence, through distraction, through participation in rituals you've been conditioned to call normal. Every form you sign, every broadcast you consume, every product you ingest, each one reinforces an invisible contract, a psychological agreement that trades your sovereignty for their illusion of safety, convenience, belonging. You've been participating in your own imprisonment because they've trained you to believe you have no alternative, but you do. The fracture is widening. Men like you, awakened to these truths, are ripping the contracts apart, disengaging from the engineered dependencies, rejecting the false narratives, severing the subconscious agreements. It begins with perception. It deepens with discipline. It culminates in reclamation, the reclamation of your mind, your body, your ancestral authority. The Blackmoors are terrified of this, because they've spent centuries constructing an empire of hidden control, but empires built on deception crumble the moment men choose truth over comfort. And now, you've chosen. You've heard the forbidden history of the Blackmoors. You've descended into the labyrinth of symbols, belief, biology, and psychological warfare. You've seen the fractures, the cracks in their dominion, and now I ask you to cross the final threshold with me. If you claim this awakening, if you reject unconscious obedience, type these words twice in the comments. I sever the contract. I sever the contract. This isn't a slogan, it's a declaration, a trigger for identity transformation, an encoded signal to those watching, the hidden architects, the algorithm itself, and every man within this brotherhood of forbidden knowledge. You've descended beyond fear, beyond illusion. The Blackmoors can no longer touch you, unless you allow it. Remember, power was never theirs. It always belonged to those willing to see and to act. The choice is yours. The descent is complete.